We left off yesterday finishing up with Japanese American internment. And unfortunately with Japanese American internment, it's often a spot in American history that we gloss over and pretend that everything was okay and that it wasn't that big of a deal. But the reality is of Japanese American internment is that we like to say that, oh, it's internment, right? And we use the word internment instead of concentration because it sounds a lot better to say internment than concentration, given the historical context of what else is going on in the world, right? I mean, it'd be kind of bad if we were calling them concentration camps. But are they concentration camps? Yes, or we are concentrating a specific group of people based on their ethnic identity. And so the tipping point between what we were doing with the Japanese Americans in internment versus what the Germans, the Nazis, were doing to the Jewish people, there isn't that large of a tipping point that could have gone one way or the other. Let's say the war would have gone and maybe we would have had an attack on California. Could have that tipped us and tipped the scale? Obviously, we won't know because of historical hindsight, but you have to understand that racism was as prevalent in the United States as it was throughout the rest of the world. So it's not like we're unique in it, nor is Germany that unique in their ideas and their ideology. Okay? And the eugenics and the ethnocentrisms that existed in Nazi Germany existed in pretty much every single one of the developed countries of the world, including the United States. Okay? Now, there are other groups of people that World War II, in some lights, helps them, and in others, hurts them. And so we look at those as well. One of those particular groups is the Hispanics or Mexicans, and some Mexican Americans. When we look at this time frame, in 1942, as a result of the beginning of the war, we see a lot of our white men going off to fight in World War II. And so as a result of that, it leaves a gap of who can work in the fields. Now, we need somebody to work in our fields to help raise the crop because we have this increased farm production that's necessary in order to fight a war. Well, who's going to be out working in the fields? Hispanics. It's the best resource for the United States, and it's not the first time we've used Hispanics or used Mexicans to help our American system and be able to have crops harvested during a time of war. We did this when? When else have we done this? What? I didn't hear you, Cole.
World War I.
World War I. Okay, thank you. But we've done this in World War I. But when Great Depression hit, what did we do with those Hispanics or those Mexicans? We told them to go away, to get out, to go home, right? Okay, we didn't want them here anymore. And we'll see that exact same program or that exact same pattern occur not only during this time frame in American history, but we pretty much see it in every time period in American history when there's any kind of economic hardship, where we'll basically look at the migrant worker as being the one who's stealing all the jobs for white Americans. Well, here's the reality of it. The vast majority of the work that migrant workers are doing, the rest of you do not want that work. Okay? You would not want to be out working in a field like they are and picking like berries or whatever else. But anyways, under the Bracero program instituted by FDR in 1942, it created short-term contracts. So you could come to the United States on this short-term contract and be able to work. The program itself was due to end in 1947, and it ultimately does come to a close in 1947. Under then the administration of, I believe it's Eisenhower wanting the United States to grow in prosperity, but also to be a little bit more isolated post-World War II, he argues that we need to have these Hispanic Americans return back to Mexico, and so he institutes what he calls, if I remember correctly, it's called the Wetback Program. No joke, okay?
Well, that's
Go back. Yes, it is, just slightly, right? But that is exactly what the program was called. Now, for Mexican Americans, then, there are some that are citizens of the United States that will serve in World War II. However, there's not a large percentage of them that does. And the majority that serve in World War II serve in support roles. So in kitchen staff, things like that. They're not active out on the front lines as a nearly great a number as any of the other minority groups, but some of them are serving on those front lines. But there is conflict amongst the white Americans and amongst the Hispanics living specifically in Los Angeles and Los Angeles County. This largely erupts over conflict, which on the surface is about clothing, but on the underneath side is about the draft, it's about the use of rationing of products, it's about the conflict between young white males and young white Hispanic males, or young Hispanic males, not white Hispanic males, but Hispanic males. And that conflict then erupts in what's called the Zoot Suit riots. Now on the surface, right, it's about clothing. And the reason why is because amongst the Hispanic population in LA, there was this fancy kind of suit that was very much in fashion at the time. It had a much longer coat tail, was a lot looser, a lot bigger, and so as a result of that zoot suit look, there was a lot more fabric that was required to make the zoot suit. But in a time of rationing, where we're supposed to be cutting back and not living extravagantly, for the servicemen in LA, they looked at these zoot suiters as basically kind of going against the grain of the fabric of society of withdrawing or of going without. And so that conflict, coupled with male testosterone and everything else like that, draft riots, all this other stuff, right? Coupled with all of those things, it winds up erupting in violence between the servicemen and the Navy men and the zoot suiters, the Hispanics. Now, unfortunately for the Hispanics, it does not go their way. It actually, even though most modern historians believe that the riots and the fighting in the riots were actually caused by the servicemen and not the zoot suiters, but what we see is that the zoot suiters often are the ones that are punished. Why?
Because they're not white.
Because they're not white, okay? And on top of that, right, I mean, we wouldn't want to be punishing our servicemen that are fighting for us or are stationed or going to be fighting for us in this course of the war, right? And in the end, in Los Angeles, the zoot suit was actually made illegal. So it was illegal to wear in Los Angeles. The other group that will serve with distinction during the course of World War II, stupid timing names. That will serve with distinction during the course of World War II are the Native Americans. The Native Americans largely will serve in different branches, and actually of all the ethnic minorities, they have the largest percentage of their population that will actually serve in the course of World War II. The vast majority of them serve as infantrymen, but there are others throughout, although they did not ever receive any positions of leadership within the military. Where they see their greatest amount of success is in the use of the Navajo language with the Navajo code talkers. Now here's the deal with the Navajo code talkers. We see within that there was this ability for them to use their native language in order to transmit language and transmit messages that then could not be depicted or deciphered by the enemy. The really amazing thing about this is that this program would not have been possible had it not been for one of FDR's New Deal programs. Does anybody remember what that act was called?
It was some of the Navajo, no?
Well, I mean, it is with the Navajo, but it's with all the Native Americans. The Indian Reorganization Act. Ring a bell? No? Maybe? No, not quite, but Indian Reorganization Act, which repeals the Dawes Act, which the Dawes Act made it illegal for you to speak in your native tongue, to speak in the language of those American Indians and of those tribes. But with the Dawes the Indian Reorganization Act, it argues that no, you can now speak in your native tongue, and not only that, but it actually created schools and created programs and financing to allow for the teaching of that native language. So some of those languages that were on the verge of dying were able to be brought back as a direct result of that. And now here in World War II, we're using it to our advantage, right? Before where we were so threatened by the language that we were threatened about it, that it would conflict with our American ideals and Americanism. And now here, we're using that language to help us. The Japanese are never able to crack the codes from the Navajo, which is absolutely cool and amazing. The other place that we have a huge effect on in World War II is on the role of women, to a certain extent. Now, when we look at World War women going into war, we see that more and more women during the course of World War II will enter into the workforce than did during World War I. In fact, about 5 million American women will actually join the labor force, and the vast majority of them will be working in factories. Well, not the vast majority, but about 1/3 of them will be working in factories. So we will see a huge uptick in the number of women working in factories. By the end of the war, though, American women are still paid less than men, even within that. And once the war is over, the idea was that women were returned to return to the home. Despite the gains that women get in being able to work outside of the home and having some more independence with that, women very much are still put into this typical role of what a woman was supposed to be. And so even with this idea that, hey, women can go out and work, women are strong, we can do it, we can go and work in these factories, we can do the job that a man can do, we can be a part of the military, and in fact, through the course of this, we see over 258,000 American women who will actually serve in the military. But despite that, images such as this, recruiting American women into the military, and images such as Rosie the Riveter here, recruiting American women into the factory system, very much has something very in common with each other. What do you notice about the imagery of her?
They're so beautiful.
They're still pretty, they're still wearing makeup, they're still very feminine. So despite the ideas about them going into the workforce and that we can do it, we can do what a man can do, yes you can, but you still have to look like a woman while you're doing it. Now that doesn't mean that there weren't pieces of propaganda that made women out to be in a more masculine light. In fact, there is a piece of Rosie the Riveter where she looks much more masculine. She's got some big muscles going on and she's flexing her big old muscles. But the reality of that is that she's still wearing makeup, and that image was not used nearly as often as this atypical image of Rosie the Riveter. But American women do go out into the Army Corps and others. We see the creation of the WAC, the women, or WAAC either way, but it's the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. We see the creation of the WAVES, which stands for the Women's Appointment for Voluntary Emergency Service. The WAF, which is the Women's Air Force, Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, sorry. The WASP, which is the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, okay? And so we do see American women working through the military as well during the course of World War II, and more women who will be in the service during World War II than were in World War I. Okay, now you remember World War I is the first time that American women can officially be a part of the military. In World War II, we're seeing more. What we see in the course of World War II, though, is that women are still in these secondary roles. They're still in these helper-type jobs. So they're working as secretaries. The greatest amount of kind of combat that women see will be in the Women Air Force Service Pilots, the WASPs. And in this situation, they actually would fly military equipment into war zones and then it landed into war zones. In addition to that, they also would do topography studies of the islands in the Pacific that they were planning on going to, so that the men, when they got there to fight, would have a better chance of actually being able to be victorious during the course of those battles. But again, still, they largely were in these subservient roles. As a direct result of more and more women being in the factories and more women also working within the military system, we see once again that Congress will begin looking at the signing of the ERA. Do we remember what the ERA was? The Equal Rights Amendment, written by Alice Paul. Very good, yeah. But unfortunately, Alice Paul once again does not get it pushed through Congress, and it stalls in Congress only to be killed in the 1980s. But again, women are still pushed into this role of maintaining that femininity. So even in their military uniforms, they were required as part of their military uniform to not only have their hair done, but to wear makeup. Okay? So they were required to remain and retain some of that elements of female femininity. In addition to that, as many strides as women took forward, like I said, when the war is over, women are expected to return home and take care of the families and to raise a family. And in the 1950s, we very much see this role of women being that within the home. And when we get to 1950s culture, we'll be talking more about that particular role. In addition to that, as much as people today might argue that the American pinup was designed to and gave women some sense of empowerment, it actually does not. It over-sexualizes women and takes away a lot of their sense of independency. Once again, it's putting them back into this role of being subservient to men. Okay? Now, the last area that we see kind of a shift for America is with mobilizing Americans. Much like in World War I, where we had the committees of public information to get that propaganda out and to spread that information around, in 1942 we'll see the creation of the Office of War Information. This was largely headed by and run by a producer, Mr. Frank Capra, and he produced many films that were designed in order to encourage Americans to be more involved with the war. In addition to that, we had Norman Rockwell, who was a famous painter, but he often created numerous different pieces of propaganda, and most of the ones you're most familiar with and have seen throughout this presentation were Norman Rockwell pieces of propaganda, including this one that takes Wilson's forced freedom speech and puts it in visual format for the American public. In addition to that, we also see the use of cartoons, including the use of Daffy Duck, in order to convince the American public that we needed to be at war and what was so bad with the Germans. This is actually, you know, good old VHS tape here, right? I know. What is this ancient looking thing? There is going to be a day when I'm up here teaching and kids are going to look at me and I have this here and they're going to be like, what is that? Yeah. Right? There's going to be that day. That's going to be a sad day. But this came out in 1988. And it has several different cartoons on it, but the cartoons are much older than 1988, but the VHS is from 1988. And when I first started teaching, I know the random story, but when I first started teaching, I could remember this and I wanted to use it. And I asked my mom, I was like, Mom, where's that VHS with like Daffy Duck and Daffy the Commando? And my mom just was like, I have no idea what you're talking about. We don't even have anything like that. I'm like, yes, we do. So then the next time I went home to Wyoming, I like dug through boxes and found it. And I was like, yes, it does exist. I'm not crazy. But anyways, so, well, you'll get to see one in just a second. So I'm going to show you two just short clips. I'm actually going to stop them. I'm not going to play them the whole way through. The first one is actually a part of a documentary series that combines some stuff from Frank Capra and some of the different newsreels that he would put out. And these were typically played prior to the beginning of a movie, of a motion picture. The other place that we see a lot of this information go out is through the radio. By the mid-1940s, basically 1/3 of Americans that's not an accurate number. Let me go back on here. 80% of Americans, so like way more than that. 80% of Americans actually have a radio within their home, so it's very easy for them to get this information. But this is from Frank Capra's Why We Fight, or is about Frank Capra's Why We Fight, and some of his other ones, which also included Destination Tokyo in 1943, and there was a few others as well, basically one every year he starts producing. But he used stock footage such as this to show Americans what the purpose was for us to do.
England to pieces. It was brooding about an invasion of Russia. Well, the United States was not ready for war.
The American Institute of Public Opinion, known as the Gallup poll, asked a representative cross-section of American people, if another war develops in Europe, should America take part again? No. 95%. We the people had spoken. 19 out of 20 of us said, include us out.
Then Pearl Harbor.
December 7th, 1941.
After Pearl Harbor, the Pentagon went to Frank Capra
Well, yeah,
to
he's
create a
still
series
used
of
to having
films
his elbow
to
up and nice and
get
high for the rest of his
America
arm
on
to
the
be up nice
side
and high.
of the conflict in Europe.
They're just learning how to do it.
Still, licensed by Hollywood trained craftsmen.
Capra at that time
Yeah,
was
when we used
one
to
of the
say
most
the Pledge
celebrated
of
directors
Allegiance, we
in the
used to
country.
pledge the
More than any other director, Capra was very
We
good
stopped
at
doing
making
that.
movies
Oh,
about
I
the
know.
average American.
College students, rich man, poor man, beggar man, thief, doctor,
Historical context,
lawyer,
right?
merchant, chief.
Critics call it Capricorn, but I find his movies unbelievably charming and representative of an America that most of us hope existed at one point.
Yesterday, USA. Sights and sounds left behind for the duration, but never forgotten. The motion picture is seen to that. It follows the soldier to the far reaches of battle.
He was perhaps the best director to tap into the average American's conscience and heart and sensibility about, basically what you're doing is you're asking people to release their children to go to war in a foreign country.
Men from the green hills of New England, the sun-baked plains of the Middle West.
Okay, so pervasive is this within our American culture, though. It shows up in our cartoons as well. This is just one of them. We won't watch both of them, but there's also a Yankee Doodle Daffy. So.
That's actually a good one.
Yeah, it's a good one too. Yeah. But.
This is hello.
It's like kartoffel. That's a potato.
Yeah, that was not a correct translation.
No, it's not. Not even remote.
It said something like
Oh, you're dumb. You got him.
The spikes are World War I. Oh.
the sign of the old world over. It's the poor what get the blame, while the rich has all the gravy. Now I'm glad of light and shine. Put out those lights! Schultz!
Yeah. Only a second.
Say, dear friends, what time is it? When you hear the tone, it will be exactly 6:45 on 1/4. Sure? May I present you with this little token of our esteem? For me? Don't be ashamed, don't be ashamed. Oh, just a little going away present. Well, see you around. Schultz!
Okay, hold on. It goes on, but obviously the point of it is not so much that it's historically accurate, because obviously it's not, but it shows you that this propaganda and these ideas of anti-German, anti-Nazism, why and we were fighting and why we needed to keep sacrificing for this war are prevalent throughout our history, or throughout our society, even so much that it's popping up, of course, in our cartoons. So, and that's one that I enjoy. See, now you know why I was so intent on finding it, right? Yeah. In 1942, then, it really becomes kind of a critical year for the Allied powers. As we begin into 1942, Japan controls most of most of Southeast Asia. In fact, so much that the United States has lost control of the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, the Dutch East Indies. The Germans have control of most of Western Europe, with the exception of just a few countries, including Spain and Portugal, Switzerland and Sweden. In addition to that, they are targeting and pushing into Russia. They have control of most of northern Africa. And so what we're seeing, and in addition to that as well, the Germans have sunk more than 8 million tons of Allied supplies, and they've killed about 25% of the military of the USSR, and are pushing through into Stalingrad and trying to defeat them at Stalingrad, which, had they defeated the Russians at Stalingrad, it pretty much would have been a done deal for the Russians at that point. Obviously, they don't defeat them at Stalingrad, but we are losing, and we really need to be able to somehow come up with a plan to defeat the Axis powers. And so as a result of that, the big three will meet in what becomes a series of conferences. But the first initial conference is in Casablanca in 1943. And it is at this Casablanca conference in which, unfortunately, Stalin is unable to attend. Why? Because he's a little busy right now with Stalingrad and doesn't make it to the conference. But it's at the Casablanca conference that we begin to look at how we are going to deal with the course of this war and what we're going to do. We basically, at that conference, discuss our path to war and decide that there we're going to kind of agree upon this idea of an unconditional surrender. Now, our relationship with Stalin, it's not a good one. It's shaky at best. But, you know, the friend of our enemy is our, the enemy of our enemy is our friend. I said it wrong, sorry. The enemy of our enemy is our friend, and so therefore we're going to get along with him for the time being. There's also something really important to point out when you're noticing photos of the big three when they are sitting together. FDR always is sitting in the center, and they are always seated. They are never standing because FDR did not want to appear weak compared to the two. FDR always typically wore larger clothes, including a larger cloak, in order to hide the frailness of his body. Even into 42 and 43, he begins to get weaker and weaker as time moves on as a result of complications with his polio. And so the war really does take quite a bit of toll on his body. And you can see over the course of photos taken of FDR, you can see that the war taking a greater and greater toll on him as a person. But it is within those conferences that we kind of set up what we're going to do. First at the Casablanca conference, and we agree to that unconditional surrender of our enemies. The other thing we agree at in the Casablanca conference is that the United States' attack for war is basically going to be severalfold. One, first and foremost, as per the Atlantic Charter, we're going to go into Europe first and foremost and deal with Japan later. The second part of this is we would use Northern Africa kind of as a proving ground or a training ground for our American troops, which largely are not really prepared for fighting in this war. They don't have very good training already for that. The next part of that is we're going to go into the soft underbelly of Europe, meaning we're going to go through Italy because we feel that that's where the Axis forces are at their weakest, and largely it really is where they're at their weakest. Although the Germans control most of Italy, the reality of it is that the Italian government under Mussolini is very, very weak, and there are a lot of people that want Mussolini dead and are willing to help the Allied powers to kill Mussolini and to overthrow his government. And eventually that's exactly what happens. The last part of that plan is then eventually we would open up a Western Front. Now, during a series of conferences, Stalin very much wants the United States to open up a secondary front much sooner in the West because they believe that that would take the pressure off of them against Hitler. And although we agree to do that, we'd agree to do that as long as they agree when the war is done with Germany that they too would declare war on Japan and basically work with us to defeat the Japanese. Now, while they do declare war eventually on Japan, they do it so late in the game that it really doesn't have any kind of a dramatic effect on the course of the war, and we're already using the atomic bombs by that time. In fact, we'd already dropped the first atomic bomb when Russia declares war on Japan. In addition to that, the when we look at our pushing into the Western Front, we do that pretty slowly. Our leaders, including Eisenhower and Patton, basically said, hey, let's take our time moving through here, because if we go really, really fast, it means a lot of our troops are going to die. If we go slower, it means more Russian troops will die. And we're okay with that, okay? So it takes us a while to do that. Finally, the Yalta Conference, we decide what we'll do with Japan, basically, and what we're going to do with Manchuria and in that region. And then lastly, the Potsdam Conference is what we'll do with Germany once the war is over. But those big three will largely work together to deal with that strategy. Now, our U.S. strategy then has to look at a couple of things. One, we have to look at our defense of the seas. Largely, we are pretty weak, and if you remember in 42, we had about 8 million tons of Allied strategic materials that are being sunk by the German U-boats. And as a result of that, we have to somehow be able to combat them. This forces us and pushes us to adapt new technology, including the use of radar, which allows us to find the radar and sonar, which allows us to find the submarines, and thus either A, be able to avoid them, or B, be able to strike at them using torpedoes and other objects to be able to defend ourselves against them. In addition to that, the United States will begin bombing raids on Germany and on German cities. specifically what we called strategic locations, locations in which they were building munitions and building weapons of war. But these strategic bombing raids are by no means strategic. Bombing raids were not strategic because you couldn't, it's not like we had like heat-seeking missiles or anything like remotely like that. Our bombing raids were mostly carpet bombing. So you would literally go into an area that was pretty close to where you wanted to target, and you would bomb the heck out of it and fly away. And yes, you would hit your target, but you would also hit a lot of unintended targets, including civilian targets. Now, this is not something, though, that is different compared to what the other countries are doing. You have to look at it and look at the fact that when we get into World War II, our weaponry and technology has advanced enough that we can no longer keep civilians out of the course of war and prevent civilians from dying during war. However, it hasn't advanced far enough for us to be super strategic about where we're placing weapons to keep civilians out of war. Does that make sense? Because we no longer have gentlemen's warfare. We're not standing up in a line and shooting at each other and going to a field of battle to ensure that that happens. But at the same time, we're also we don't have the strategic guided missiles, etc.
Okay, I remembered I hadn't asked my discussion question.
Yeah, sure.
It's okay? Okay.
It's about what we're talking about right now?
Kind of.
Kind of?
Okay, this is like America and the Holocaust, that.
Yeah, so can we talk about that in just a minute here?
Yeah.
Okay, so hold on to it, okay? So the United States begins pushing in there, and then we go and decide to go into North Africa. Basically, our presence into North Africa signaled Germans' strategic hold in North Africa, and that's largely because the British will force them out of Egypt and into the center, and we'll push from Algeria and Morocco and push the Germans into the center, push Rommel into the center, and as a result of that, we're able to defeat the quote-unquote Desert Fox. But it's largely that allows us to do that. Now it's Eisenhower that is largely leading our troops in northern Africa. He will have over 400 ships, 1,000 planes, and 100,000 troops that will help us to be victorious there. At the end of our fighting with the Germans, and in 43 we will reach an armistice with the Germans. But in order to get this armistice signed, we basically signed the armistice with Jean Durand, and basically that armistice says that, look, you're gonna surrender Africa to the Allies, but we are gonna make sure that we keep Nazi sympathizer in power in Vichy, France. Okay? Which is Delon. He's pissed about it. Okay? Which makes sense, right? I mean, why are you going to keep a Nazi in power and basically give him the ability to have that? We shouldn't be doing that. But the reality of it is for the United States and for the British forces at that point in time, France was not our concern. It would be, but it wasn't our concern at that point in time. But we do get the surrender in Africa in the spring of 42. From there, in spring of 43, I'm sorry. In spring of 43, then, June of 43, the United States will then push into Sicily, going for, and to trying to defeat them in Sicily. And so in the summer of 1943, on 1 month, Patton is able to defeat the Mussolini's forces there. Yes, yeah, go right ahead. By June 4th of 44, then, we're able to move into Italy and begin pushing through Italy, led by Patton again. By the 4th of June, we're right outside of Rome. The United States movement into Italy will cause a crisis, kind of crisis, in the Italian government, in which the king will basically dispose of Mussolini. Mussolini is briefly rescued by Hitler's forces and returned to power, only to once again be removed from power, hung, then dragged through the city streets, and then hung up again for public display. Okay? That being said, Germany still would retained control of most of northern Italy. And it takes the United States about 5 months to really kind of break free and push through into northern Italy. So this is what we call the Battle of Monte Cassino. And basically the only way that we're able to destroy and take the region is we basically level it. So it has since been rebuilt. This is during the course of the war, this is it being rebuilt. And so we've rebuilt that region, or Italy has rebuilt it. By the 5th of June, we are able to free the first capital from Nazi occupation. We're able to free and liberate Rome. But most of our U.S. officials are really beginning to be frustrated with our focus on Italy. They believe that we are taking too long to do that, and that it has little strategic value, and it was diverting supplies away from the possibility of opening up a Western Front, which would allow us to go in and to potentially go in and start that Western Front and push through Germany. Now, the idea within that for some was that we should be helping the Jewish people, but for the vast majority of Americans, we really did not care about the plight of the Jew. It was more about the defeat of Nazi Germany. But it is because of that Henry Stitzman, our Secretary of War, will begin to argue that we need to have a second Western Front, because since the Russians were victorious at Stalingrad, if we don't open up that second Western Front, it leaves the Russians the possibility of being able to march through Germany and keep on marching all the way into France. And we cannot leave the Russians as the dominant force in Europe. It would not work well. So it brings the United States to the point where we are going to begin a plan for the invasion of Europe through Operation Overlord. May, your question about the Holocaust, Megan.
Okay, so in this sort of like essay thing,
yep.
It made it seem like the reason we went to intervene in this was for moral reasons, but I always thought that it was to stop just the conquering. So
yeah.
It
When we are attacked on Pearl Harbor, or at Pearl Harbor, right, and we wind up going to war with Germany, we begin to have this argument that we need to liberate Europe. It's not about liberating the Jewish people per se, it's about liberating Europe from Nazi occupation, okay? The United States knew that the Holocaust was going on for a very long time prior to actually going to war in Europe. In fact, so much so that there's a ship, if I remember correctly, the name of the ship is the Liberty, which is horrible, kind of ironic maybe, I don't know if that's the right way to look at it, but it was a ship of Jewish refugees that were coming to the United States to try to escape Nazi occupation and eventually the death camps, right? And they had fled Nazi Germany, made it to a ship, were coming to the Americas to flee that. And rather than us taking them in, we actually literally sent the boat away. Because we said, I'm sorry, but our quotas are full. We're not going to take you in the United States. As a result, they went into the Caribbean to try to seek refuge in the Caribbean, where they were once again denied refuge in the Caribbean. That ship had to return back to Europe and subsequently had to return back to Nazi-occupied territories. The vast majority of the people that were on that ship, many of which were actually women and children, wound up in the concentration camps and the death camps and died. So for us to argue that we are doing this for moral purposes, and today, in today's world, we would like to argue that yes, we're doing this for moral purposes, right? But the reality of it was it was not about the liberation of the Jewish people. It was about the liberation of Europe from Nazi occupation. Does that make sense? Okay? It's more a political move than anything else. It has less to do with the will or saving the Jewish people.
Yeah, that's what I thought, because that's what Mr. Johansson had told us, and then I read that, and I'm like...
Yeah, so that's historical argumentation, right? Mm-hmm. That's a historian who's making an argument based off of history. It is not the dominant historical argument, but that doesn't mean that it is not a historical argument that it's out there. And yes, we were looking to liberate, if you want to look at it, we were liberating everybody. So yes, that would be the Jewish people from Nazi occupation. And once our American soldiers actually begin to see what's going on in the camps, there becomes a greater and greater driving force to liberate more of the camps. But still, we really don't move super, super fast to liberate the camps. We'd rather the Russians die in liberating the camps than American servicemen die in trying to liberate the camps. So again, there's where I would argue that morally, we probably weren't in it for the Jewish people.